Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Yud Gimel. Today's daf is sponsored by Harriet Hartman in loving memory of her grandson, Rav Nachman, who sacrificed his life in Gaza December 2024. Today's daf is sponsored by David Can in honor of Professor Paul Gompers and Dr. Jody Duche. Thank you for your magnificent hospitality. We're going to get started today with the very top of our daf. What we started, or we're going to end right now, is division of, we're going to continue talking about division, but right now we're going to finish up division of two properties. And what we started yesterday was all sorts of situations where we had this din of bar mitzvah, that one would prefer a certain field because it's closer to another field of his, or we had with the bechor who gets two portions, and he insists that, right, he get the two portions next to each other and not two fields that are far from each other. We discussed a bunch of variations there. Are we kofino midat stone? Can we force, it's actually kind of funny, midat stone, which means not to do behavior of the people of stone who weren't considerate one of the other, or can we not? Do we not kofino midat stone in different situations? Our mission now is going to discuss ha gisa nigra. We're at the very top of our daf. The ha gisa nahara. If you have a field that two sons inherited, and on one side there's a river, which is, obviously used for watering the field. And on another side, okay, let's just assume, you can see if you have a regular Gemara, there's a picture in Rashi, already a diagram of what this is. Usually you think that means it's complicated. This is really not complicated at all. So let's say on one side you have a river, and the adjacent side to that, right, on the other side, here it's Mizrach and Safon, right, north and east. The east side, you have the river. On the north side, you have a water channel. Now, each of those is very helpful, but each of them, maybe there's more of a chance one would dry up than the other, or who knows what could happen, but it could be something will go wrong on one and then the other. So we want to create a situation where everyone gets equal access to the river and equal access to the water channel. So how do you do that? Well, you divide it, palginla bikarnazol, which basically means we're going to divide it, and we're going to make like a big X through the field, and then it's going to cut it up kind of like a pie. Okay, you're going to have one big X that divides it into four, and then another, right, kind of perpendicular to each other, another cross in, and then you're going to end up with basically 8 pie slices. Okay, it's square, but it doesn't really matter. It's still like a pie, 8 slices, and everyone's going to get every other piece of the pie. Okay, and in that way, we maximize the space that each one is going to get that's next to the river, because assuming the river's on the side there, if we cut it like a pie, then each one has a big section that's equal next to the pie, right, next to the river, and then you're going to end up, right, we're going to divide the two sides that are next to the river and the channel evenly, and then the other two sides evenly as well. Okay, so if you see in my picture, again, it might be a little different in every version, but as Reishin, that means Reuven, Shimon, Reuven, Shimon, Reuven, Shimon, Reuven, Shimon. Obviously, it doesn't relate to the fact that you're going to end up with all these parts of the field that are not next to the other, after we just talked about how important it was to have adjacent field. In this case, it's more important to have water than adjacent field. So because of that, we want to share it equally. Okay, now we're going to move on to the sugya that's going to take us for almost the entire daf. Lo traklim. Okay, now the Mishnah had said we can't divide up a hall, and there were a few other things that just are not really dividable. So hall, we mean like a nice big room, like a drawing room type thing, or the next thing actually they said was a drawing room, but something along those lines. Now, it depends how big the drawing room is. If you can divide it and it gives each person a nice big drawing space or a room, it doesn't even have to be large, but usable, great. But aim behen kedei lezeh mahu. What if it's not big enough? Then what do you do? So what do you do? Well, obviously, you both retain shared ownership. But what if one doesn't want to do that? One says, look, this isn't worth my while. I don't want to share this room with you. I'm not interested. So what can you do? Do you have anything at your disposal? And we're going to see we're going to learn the halacha. The Rav Yehuda is going to say, we use this. Rav Nachman says, we don't employ this option. Okay, but we're now going to start learning about different ways when this would be used. I want to be very clear from the beginning. We're only talking about a situation where they don't both agree. If it's not a big enough space to share and they both agree to split it, or they both agree one will sell to the other, then anything they agree on obviously they can do. There's no halachic rules, and this is we talked about in the beginning of the Masechta. It's not like the Torah gives rules and how to do these things. No, if you want to split it any way you want. You want to one buy the other one out, go for it. Here we're talking about where one side is happy to stay in the status quo, and the other side really doesn't want to have this shared property and wants to insist that one sells to the other. So can they insist? And if so, what can they insist? Rav Yehuda Amar, I dina de gud o agud. We're going to get these words clear today, gud o agud. We're going to use it a lot. We employ the law of gud or agud. What does that mean? Gud means it's the same root if you see. One is good, you do it, and one is agud, I will do it. So gud means that we name a price, okay, we evaluate a price. So gud means I say to you, I want to split it, you don't. So I come and say to you, listen, you assess the price and you buy it from me for that price. Or agud. Or you let me assess the price and I'll buy it from you. So what gud or agud means that I can insist that you choose, but you choose only between two possibilities and not between the possibility of let's remain partners. Okay, so I'm giving you a choice, a forced choice. Okay, I don't force you which one to choose, but I do force you to divide it, that one of us is going to be the sole owner and the other one will have to pay the money, right? The other one will pay the money for it and end up with money rather than the item. So according to Rav Yehuda, if I don't want to stay here as shared property, I can insist that you either buy it or you sell it. Okay? That's something I'm allowed to insist. And Rav Nachman Amar late dina agud o agud. Rav Nachman says, I can't insist if you don't want to divide it. I can't insist. I can't force you to either sell it or buy it. So he doesn't think you can do this. So we're going to start off with one question on Rav Nachman, and then we're going to raise difficulties. I'm going to distinguish between asking a question and raising difficulties. Raising difficulties is usually done and will be in this sugya from tannaitic sources. First, we're just asking a logical question. Rava doesn't understand something about Rav Nachman. Amalei Rava le Rav Nachman, ledidach da'amar le'din de gud o agud. Rav Nachman, you say there is no law of gud or agud. So if that's the case, bechor upashut sheniach len avihen eved u'beimat me'ah ketzad osim. So what are we going to do in a case where a bechor who gets double portion and a brother inherit two things, a slave and an animal that's not kosher, that you're going to use for working in your field? How are they going to divide it? In other words, how can you have a situation where it's evenly divided when one gets two and one gets one, and you have two items? Like, how on earth are you going to divide it? Now, it's not so complicated. And once we get to the answer, I'll explain to you what some of the commentaries think that Rava was even asking, because the answer is pretty obvious. But Amar le she'ani omer oved lezeh yom echad u'lezeh shnei yamim. So I don't know why it's so complicated. If one gets 2/3 and one gets 1/3, so very simply, one will work the animal for 2 days a week and then give it to the other brother for 1 day, then 2 days, 1 day, 2 days, 1 day, and that's the way they're going to keep going. So that's not actually so complicated. So what was Rava's question? In other words, Rava was saying there's no real good way to divide this, in which case the only way to do it is to sell or buy, right? One will sell, the other will buy, obviously. And why does he think, and why didn't he just bring an example of two brothers and not, why did it have to be a bechor and a pashut? So what they explained is that what was bothering Rava is that getting something for 2 days is not the same as getting it for 1 day. And that's, besides, obviously you're getting more, you're the bechor, you get double portion, but it's not 2 equal portions to 1 portion, because 2 days together allows you a lot more flexibility. If you only have the animal for 1 day, let's say you have a field far away, you're not going to be able to take the animal to that field by the time you get there and have to get home. The 2 days is not a fair, it's not really like 1 + 1. Okay, if it was 1 + 1 versus 1, it would be fair. So he gets 2, but the 2 is infinitely more valuable. And then it's not a fair division, which Rav Nachman thinks, no, that's not true. It's a fair division anyway. Okay, and that's the answer. So that was a side question. I say, rather than a difficulty, this is sort of just, how do you explain, well, what will we do in this situation? And then we explain why he specifically brought that and not 2 brothers, because 2 brothers would be 1 day, 1 day, 1 day, 1 day. That wouldn't even be a question. But now we're going to bring our difficulties from tannaitic sources. And we're going to start with a very famous Mishnah, Beit. It's a Mishnah we've learned before. Misha chetzio eved v'chetzio ben chorin. You remember him, the half slave, half free free person. What does this mean? It means that there was a slave who was owned by two people. He's a Canaanite slave. Let's go back and remember all the rules of Canaanite slaves. Canaanite slaves are basically, they do a Brit Milah and they become part of the household. Okay, and they're somewhat Jewish. They're not exactly Jewish. They're not considered Jews, but they keep mitzvot. They're exempt from time-bound mitzvot, kind of like women, although we did discuss recently that there's a bit of a difference between that the last time we had the sugya. But we basically have someone who's a slave. They're only allowed to marry a slave woman. They can't be with a Jewish woman because they're not Jewish. But if the master ever freed them, then they actually, because they already did a Brit Milah, they already went to the mikvah, and then when they get freed, they automatically become Jewish. Now, you're not supposed to free them. That's a whole different story. But if you did, for whatever reason, in certain cases where we force you to free the slave, remember, if you hit the slave, you have to free them. There are cases where, and there are cases where people do it anyway, even though you're not supposed to. If they get free, they become Jewish entirely. And then they can't marry a slave woman anymore because they're a Jew and the slave woman is not Jewish, but they, or a maidservant, you could call her. And then they're a Jew and they can marry a Jewish woman. Here we have our complicated case that the Gemara loves to talk about here. It's our mission talking about it because it's just a fascinating, probably mostly theoretical case, although it could have happened, which is, what if you have two masters and one frees you and the other one doesn't, and you become a half slave, half free person? So what do? Well, just like in the previous case we just discussed, Ovedet Rabo Yom Echad, that's no Yom Echad. So you're split in the way you work. One day you work for your master. The other day you're already freed. You're a free person. You work for yourself. Divrei Beit Hillel. That's Beit Hillel. Beit Shamai omrim tikantem et rabo. Okay, you give a very nice solution for the master. That's how the master can continue to have his slave work for him, because the slave has a part of the slave that's still a slave, or the person has a part of him that's still a slave. So that part can still work, and that works perfectly. But at that smolo tikanta, but Beit Shammai says, what about his personal status? Lisa shifchai no yachol. He can't marry a maidservant because he's not, because of the side of him that's free. Lisa bat chorin no yachol, but he can't marry a Jewish woman, a free woman, because, right, a non-slave woman, because of his slave side. So, right, you can't split him in terms of his personal status. And therefore, yibatel what? So he should just never get married? You'll say that's the solution? The world was created in order to have children, to reproduce. Right, that talks about the creation. The world was created in order for people to settle it, to inhabit, to bring children into the world. You can't leave this person not being able to get married. And therefore, Beit Shammai suggests a possible solution. And this is what we call, even though it doesn't say it, although maybe it does. Yeah, that's why. Okay, I knew it said it. The Bach fixes this because it's missing some words. Ela mipnei tikun olam, because of tikun olam. Remember all the sugyot of tikun olam in Gitin, for those who learn Gitin. All these things that are not halachic reasons, but the rabbis came and instituted these takanot in order to resolve situations. We force the master, kind of like our situation. We have a situation where there's partners, right? Now, in this case, there's no more partners. It's just the slave is part owned by himself and part owned by, right? It's not the original slave owner, part owned by the other slave owner. So it's part owned by the slave owner, part owned by himself. What do? We force the master to free the slave, which is exactly this. Well, it's one side of agud or agud, right? It's forcing one side to specifically sell. Oseo toben chorin. He sells the slave basically to the slave. Now, the slave doesn't have money, but the slave makes a commitment to half his value and basically says, when I get the money, I'll pay you for my freedom. So now, that's Beit Shammai's solution. Beit Hillel didn't think you need to do that, but Beit Shammai was very convincing, and Chazru Beit Hillel lahorot kedivrei Beit Shammai. It's another reason why this is a famous case, because Beit Shammai in the end convinces Beit Hillel, and it's famous because it's tikun olam, and it's a very interesting sugya, and basically looking at the personal status and saying this is very nice for the master, but what about the slave himself? We have to help him to be able to live in this world and get married and have children. So in the end, we say we can force the master to sell the slave. Now this is, right, this is basically saying the slave can say good, right? Put a price on me and buy me, okay? Or actually the reverse, it's agud, sorry, right? What would you say? Right, agud, it's agud. I'm gonna buy, the slave can force the master to buy, for himself to buy his freedom. Now, what's the issue here? Well, that seems like you do good or agud, but no, because this is only because of tikun olam. Were it not for tikun olam, we would be doing this. So that proves there isn't din of good or agud, because this isn't right. We only do good or agud because of tikun olam. If there was no personal status issue, we wouldn't force the issue at all. We would, and obviously the slave would rather have their freedom. So, and we don't force the slave to be able to buy his freedom. He can't say to the master, buy, sell me to myself, right? Let me buy myself out. Can't say that. So what do you see? There is no din of good or agud. To which the Gemara says, no. Shanehacha de agud ika gud leka. This only goes in one direction. Remember how we started. I can say to you, either sell me your share or buy my share, right? Or buy my share. I can only force you to choose which of the two you want. So I can force it as long as you have two options. In this case, there aren't two options. Why not? It's only that the master can free the slave, and the slave buys his own freedom. You can't have the master buy the free part of the slave. Why not? For what we said before. Once the slave goes free, they're a Jew. You can't sell a Jew to become a Canaanite slave. There is no such thing. So it only goes in one direction. And now we're going to learn that it only works if you're giving the person two possibilities. And in this case, you're not giving two possibilities. You can't say buy or sell. You can only say sell to the master. You can't say buy my other half. So therefore, it's not relevant. And this is the same answer we're going to give with the next issue. Okay, we're going to bring another case against Rav Yehuda. We have two difficulties, two sources that are going to go against Rav Yehuda. We're going to resolve them. One source that's going to go against Rav Nachman, and we're actually going to try to resolve it, but in the end, we're going to be left with a question against Rav Nachman. So in the questions against Rav Yehuda, in both cases, we're going to have the same answer, which is this case is not a case of good or agud, and we don't employ good or agud because it's not relevant. Because there's only agud, there is no good. Okay, there's only sell me your half rather than sell me or buy me. Okay, or buy my half. Tashma, shnei achim, echad ani ve'echad ashir. Now we have two brothers who inherit from their father. We'll see in a minute what they inherit. And one is wealthy, one is poor. And the father leaves them a bathhouse. You could say and or, it doesn't really matter. A bathhouse and an olive press. Okay, or it could be a bathhouse or an olive press. If the father had used them for renting out, and basically it was an income generating bathhouse or olive press, very simple. Hasachar la'emtza. So you're going to keep renting out that space and divide the money. Doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. Asa'an latzmo. But if it was just used for the family, okay, we have our own private bathhouse, right? Or we have our own private olive press that we just use for our own sake and wasn't used for renting. The wealthy one can say to the poor brother, turning now to Abaye, take slaves and let them, right? You find yourself slaves, which of course the poor brother doesn't have any slaves. Let them warm the water for you, let them heat it up, and you can go bathe in the merchatz. Now the poor brother has nothing to do in a Beit merchatz. First of all, right? He doesn't have time in his life. He's busy working. He doesn't do that kind of thing. It's for rich people. It's irrelevant to him. But tough luck. The rich brother can say, I'm not selling this. I'm not renting it out. I want to use it for my own sake. It's mine. And I have slaves. And you're tough luck that you don't have slaves. Or when it comes to the Beit Habad, take your olives and bring them to the Beit Habad. Now, the poor person doesn't have land, doesn't have olives, right? They have nothing to do with it. But what do you see here? You can't, right? The obvious would be, well, the poor brother can't benefit from this, doesn't want it. So if good or agud were to work, the poor brother can go to the older brother, the rich brother, and say, right, buy me out. What do you see here? Can't do that. Okay, the rich brother can basically say, we have to remain partners, even though the poor brother really gets nothing out of it. So you would have expected them to say, Kofino midat stom here, right? It seems a little unfair to the poor brother, but they don't say that. So hatam nami gud ika agud leika. Again, this is not a question, because good or agud to come into play, you would have to have both possibilities. Now here there aren't both possibilities. Why? Because the poor brother can't say either, right? You set a price and buy from me, that he could say, or, right, I'll set a price and I'll buy it from you. Well, the poor brother has no money to buy, and therefore there's no option of that. And therefore, good or agud doesn't come into play, but it's not a difficulty against Rav Yehuda, because were there to be both sides, you could say the good or agud would have worked. Now we get to our difficulty on Rav Nachman. Tashma. If you can divide it and it's still called by its name, like let's say you have this truckline, this hall, and you divide it and each room is big enough to be called a hall, then you divide it. But if not, if you're not going to be able to have a room that would be called a hall, if you divide it, ma'alino tobedami. What does that mean? That basically means good or agud. You evaluate, you assess its value, and one side buys from the other. So that seems, one side can force the other, it seems, to buy from the other. So that seems to imply good or agud. That would go against Rav Nachman, who said we don't use good or agud. To which Rav Nachman's going to answer. I already told you that we're going to have an answer, but we're going to reject the answer. So let's start with the answer. Tannaitic. This is a classic method that you deal with when you're an Amora and they throw at you a tannaitic source. One of the ways you can answer is to say, oh, yeah, don't bother me with that tannaitic source, because I have another tannaitic source to support me. It's a debate between two tannaim, and therefore we're going to show now, we're going to attempt to show, which we're not going to succeed in, that good or agud is a machloket tannaim. So the problem is that we're going to have this bright that's not really clear what they mean, and therefore, in order to explain and come to some logical way of understanding the source, we're going to add a bunch of words and claim that the machloket is good or agud. In the end, we're going to say, no, that's not the case. Let's go back to option one, the simple reading, and we'll explain it that way, in which case it has nothing to do with good or agud. That's the structure of what we're about to do. Ditanya says in a bright, Tol ata shiur v'ani pachot. We don't know what this is talking about, so we're going to look at Rashi for a minute, who's going to tell us. Tol ata shiur v'ani pachot. It's a few lines above in Rashi. Kigon chatzil she'em ba shmona amot. As we talked about, there's a courtyard that doesn't have 8 amot by 4 amot. Remember, 8 amot by 4 amot is our magic number in courtyards, because then you can divide it into 4 by 4. Everyone has a 4 by 4 space. That's enough, 4 cubits by 4 cubits. But if it doesn't have 8 by 4 cubits and therefore can't be divided into 4 and 4, it's smaller, let's say 7, and one wants to divide it, what can he say? Okay, let's say I'm living with you in this courtyard, we're sharing the courtyard, and I don't want to share it anymore, but it's not big enough to divide. What do we say? If I say, now let's go back to the words, Tol ata shiur v'ani pachot. I say to you, you take 4 by 4, and I'll take the rest. I'll take a space of 3 by 4. I don't mind getting less. I'd rather have less, even though I can't really do too much with it. I'd prefer that option, again, only if I do. If I suggest that, shom'in lo, according to Tanakama, that works. Okay? You can take your 4 by 4. I can force you because you're in the end getting a good, nice space. And I'm, suffering myself, but I don't mind. I'm the one who wants to split it. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, Omer ein shom'in lo. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says you can't do that. If I want to do that, you can say no way, no how. Why? Why wouldn't you want that? It's in your best interest. You're getting more than me. So it doesn't make any sense, Rashbag. So hechidami, what exactly is the case? If you say it's the simple reading, my time of Rashbag makes no sense. Why shouldn't we divide it 4 and 3? I'm the one willing to take the loss. It must be that there's words missing, or is it not? That's what the lav means. Is it not that there's words missing? And this is how it should read. And now we're going to basically say what's missing here is that there's 2 different cases, there's 2 different things going on. If I say what we just said, you take 4, I'll keep 3, we listen to me, and that Rashbag even agrees with, because there's no way Rashbag would disagree. At least that's what we think right now. In a minute, we'll explain how Rashbag could disagree with that, but right now we're going to assume there's no way Rashbag disagrees with that. And then we're going to say there must have been another case that Rashbag disagreed about. And what would that have been? What other possibilities exist? Good or agud, right? So the next case in the Braita, again, it didn't say it, but we're adding words, which is a method that we use when we're stuck. Good or agud nami shom'in lo. And also, I can insist that either you buy the whole thing or I buy the whole thing from you. So that's what Tanakama says, shom'in lo, that Rashbag doesn't agree about. Ata Rashbag l'meimar ein shom'in lo, and then their whole machloket is about good or agud, and then Rav Nachman has an easy answer. Oh, you bring a Braita to contradict me? That Braita goes like Tanakama. I hold like Rashbag. Don't bother me about that Braita. So that would work very well if this was in fact the way to read that Braita. Obviously, we know already we've added words, which sometimes works when we have no choice. But the Gemara is now going to explain the Mishnah, the Braita, in a simple way, without having to add the good or agud is here, and then this has nothing to do with good or agud. Olam kedikatani. It really is the way we originally thought, that I say you take 4, I'll keep 3, and Rashbag says that doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? And as you said before, my time of Rabban Shimon Gamliel, why on earth would Rabban Shimon Gamliel hold it? I can't do that, right? I'm willing to give up on my part. Why would that be a problem? And you're getting what what's worthy of getting. Well, mishum de amrle, because you can say to me, ibidame, lately dame lameitama. Now, I'm giving you more. The question is, do you have to compensate me for it or not? Maybe you have to pay me for the 1 amma more you're getting. So if I insist, I say, listen, I'm willing to take the smaller part and pay me for the difference. Well, you could say, lately dami lameitama. I don't have money to give you. So you can say, if it's that I'm asking you for money, you can say, I'm not willing to pay money. I don't have any money to pay. It's nice that you're giving me more, but you're making me pay for it and I don't want to pay. So you can say no to that. And if it's b'matana, let's say I'm giving it to you as a gift and saying, I don't care, I'll take less. You can take the bigger part. Matana lo nichale. You could say, I don't want your gifts, right? You know this happens lots of times with people. You're like, thanks, but no thanks. I don't want to owe you anything, right? And it says, dichtiv esonei matanot yichyeh. Those who hate gifts will live long. Okay, meaning you shouldn't be taking gifts from other people, either because it's going to put you in a position that you're going to owe the person, you don't want to take gifts, or because you don't want to owe anything in general. You don't want to take more than someone else. It's not good to take gifts for all sorts of reasons. And therefore, you can say, thanks, but no thanks. I don't want the bigger part. I don't want to be in that situation where I've taken a gift from you. So that's why Rashbag thinks even the simple of, I'm willing to give you more, you might have different, right? Depending on the scenario, whether I'm demanding money from you or not demanding money from you, either which way you can say, I don't have the money to pay, or I don't want your gifts. So that explains Rashbag, which has nothing to do with good or agud. The only reason why good or agud came in was because we didn't understand Rashbag in the simple reading, and therefore I had to say there must be added words here, which we just got rid of, in which case there is no such thing of good or agud here, and therefore it doesn't contradict. The whole thing was we wanted to show that somebody holds no good or agud, like Rav Nachman, but we didn't succeed in saying that, so we're back to our difficulty with Rav Nachman. And we don't have an answer. So what we did so far, just to go back with structure, we talked about that there's a machloket in good or agud between Rav Nachman and Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda says we do employ this halacha. Rav Nachman says no, can't. We discussed through all the difficulties we raised, right? First, we had just a question on Rav Nachman that Rava asked, Rav Nachman answered. Then we had 2 difficulties on Rav Yehuda, which we resolved. While we did that, we learned, good or agud is only when one is forcing the other. We learned that good or agud is only when the person who we're forcing can take one of 2 possibilities, either to buy the whole thing or to sell the whole thing. And then we had a difficulty with Rav Nachman, tried to say it's machloket tanaim, but we're not successful. Abaye Rav Yosef. Okay, we're still continuing in this sugya. Had Rav Yehuda de Shmuel. What Rav Yehuda says that you can employ this halacha of good or agud is actually the opinion of Shmuel, which makes sense. Rav was Shmuel's student. How do we know this? We're actually going to reject it, but right now we're going to suggest that it's what Shmuel said. Ditnan, it says in our Mishnah, kitvei hakodesh, when it comes to kitvei hakodesh, a sefer Torah, for example, you can't divide it in half even if we both agree, because it's not respectful to the sefer Torah. So far, it's hard to see the connection. Amar Shmuel said on our Mishnah, lo shanu ela bekerech echad. That's only if it's all a Torah or all Nevi'im or all Ketuvim. Aval b'shnei krichot cholkim. If it's a Torah and Nevi'im together, right, or 2 volumes, we can split. Okay? Now, what does this have to do with anything? Well, a Sefer Torah and a Sefer Nevi'im are not valued the same. Okay, let's assume it's like nowadays. Sefer Torah costs a lot more than if you have a Sefer Nevi'im. Now, we don't mean a book, we like a printed book, we mean a parchment. But you have a parchment with all the Nevi'im in it, and you have a parchment with all the Torah in it. Well, those are 2 different things, right? And even if they're written together, you can still cut it in between, separate them, divide them. Now, if we're assuming that we're dividing them, so let's say I get the Torah, you get the Nevi'im, what's going to happen? I'm going to have to compensate you for the fact that I end up with the bigger one. Because if we were partners and the Sefer Torah is worth a lot more than the Sefer Nevi'im, and I take the Sefer Torah, I'm obviously going to have to compensate you. So what is that if not good or agud? It basically is going to mean that if I can force you to sell or to buy, I give you both options, but right, either you take the Sefer Torah and give me the money, the extra money, or I keep the Sefer Torah and I give you extra money, and I give you both those choices. So the fact that he says b'shnei krikol cholkim, that seems to prove good or agud, because isakadatach late dina good or agud. If you don't have that option of good or agud, insisting that the other one divide it and compensate, my area b'kerach echad afilu b'shnei krichin nami, then why should it only be kerach echad? You can't split. Even shnei krichin, 2 volumes, you shouldn't be able to divide, because how can you divide them without insisting on compensation? So you might be wondering, wait, how are these comparable? Because what we were talking about there, and that's what we're going to say right now, good or agud is only a law when I'm forcing you to divide. That's not what they were talking about here. Read the Mishnah. The Mishnah says you cannot divide kitvei kodesh. Now, that's in the case of even if we both agree to divide it. Why? Because it's not respectful to the kitvei kodesh. This has nothing to do with one forcing the other to divide it. This is talking about in general, right? Even if we both agree to divide. Now, if we both agree to divide, there's no din of good or agud, right? You don't need the din of good or agud. Good or agud, we said, is only a din where I give you an ultimatum. Either sell the whole thing or buy the whole thing, but we're not staying partners. But that's totally different than if people come willingly into it. And now we're going to say, Tirgamar Rav Shalman b'shishneim rotzim. The whole law of the Mishnah there, and Shmuel, who then said, b'shnei krichim, you can divide. You can divide a Sefer Torah and a Nevi'im if both sides want to. But not necessarily that one can force the other. Okay, so basically, what Shmuel is saying has nothing to do with good or agud. And it doesn't, what Abaye tried to tell Rav Yosef is that what Rav Yehuda said, that we can force the other side to do good or agud, and he proved it and basically said Shmuel saying the same thing, because in 2 krachim, presumably one can force the other. Basically we said, no. The 2 krachim, the 2 volumes, has nothing to do with one forcing the other. It's only in a case where they both agree. When they both agree, again, you can't split one volume because you can't split a Sefer Torah or a Sefer Nevi'im. That's not respectful for this kitvei kodesh, but they can divide 2 different books if they want to. That's only if they want to, and that has nothing to do with our topic. We're going to go back to this again, so remember that that's the case. Amar Ameimar, hilchata idina de good or agud. So Ameimar now comes and says, we paskin like Rav Yehuda, good or agud. So Amarle Rav Ashi la Ameimar. Rav Ashi questions him and says, it's kind of a funny question, but how do Rav Nachman mai? What do you do with Rav Nachman? Now, I don't know why it's such a problem. It just doesn't hold by him, which is what he's going to answer. Amarle lo shmiali. Lo shmiali means I didn't hear it, but that's not really what it means. Shmiya is usually, I don't have a masoret about it. I didn't get a tradition that that's how we rule. And klomar lo svirali, meaning I don't hold by that opinion. So there's no issue here. The low, is that really true that we don't hold like Rav Nachman? Okay, now you're going to see perhaps why Rav Ashi thought that Ameimar should have been holding like Rav Nachman, because look at the following situation that happened. The Ravim Barchinina, Rav Dimi Barchinina, these 2 brothers, Shavik Luavua Tarte Amata, left the father, bequeathed to the children, died and left them 2 maidservants. Chada Yada Apiau Bishule, it sounds kind of funny. One who had to cook, the Chada Yada Pilcha Ben Avla, and the other one who had to sew, had to, do the what do you call it, the spinning and the embroidering or weaving. So now what's the problem? Well, the problem is they both need both of them, right? And now how do they divide them? If you divide, one gets one who cooks and the other one gets one who sews, and you're going to end up with, not very even. And perhaps, we don't know which one, but seemingly one is worth more than the other. So if they're going to divide them, then, and good or agud is a law, then what will we do? We divide them, each gets one, and then one has to compensate the other. And they can, they can say, oh, one can say to the other, look, you decide, you take one and pay me back, or I'll take the more expensive one and I'll pay you back. And they came before Rava. There is no law of good or agud here. Okay, we don't force them. Now, what would be good or agud here? We split them, right? And then one would have to compensate. So what do you see here? Rava ruled like Rav Nachman, not like Ameimar said that we hold like Rav Yehuda. And that's why they're questioning. Really? So they say, wait a minute. And now we're going to learn something new about good or agud, which I guess was kind of obvious. They just didn't state it, but all the cases they brought were like this, which is Shamai Hatam. This case is different. They each here needed both of them, right? What's going to help you to have someone who cooks, but not someone who spins? You're going to have food, you're not going to have clothing. The other one's going to have clothing and no food. So in theory, they each need both, which means what? Well, good or agud works. Until now, we've been giving cases where, let's say there's a haul, and basically I say either sell me the whole thing or buy the whole thing off of me, where one gets the complete item, which is usable, and the other gets the money for a complete item, right? Which they can then go buy a haul if they want. In this case, you want to split them 1 and 1. Nobody gets a full deal here. If you want to do good or agud, it's only that one would get 2, both maidservants, and the other would get the money for it. That would be good or agud. Splitting them, like you're suggesting, what Rava said is don't split them and compensate. That was how we used good or agud here, because that's not the use of good or agud. Because in order for good or agud to work, someone has to get the whole idea. That's the whole idea. We don't want to split them. I want the complete. I want what I need. Now, if each one could do the same thing, okay, and they each had the exact same talents, then you could easily split them and one could force the other. Right there, you wouldn't even need to compensate financially because they'd both be doing the same thing and everyone would get what they needed. But in this case, no one's getting what they needed. We don't use good. You can't force someone to, because what's in the end you're doing? You're forcing someone to get a maidservant that gives them food but doesn't give them something else. Now, even though you're compensating them, still, for whatever reason, good or agud only works. It's all or nothing. And this is not an all or nothing case. So now the Gemara says, wait, it's always all or nothing? Didn't we just talk about the shnei krichim, where you split them and then, decide who's paying who the sifrei Torah person is going to have to pay the other one, right? Whether you read those words or not, but that's the gist, which is what you can say that you have to say the good or agud is only all or nothing. And the assumption is about the sifrei Torah. You need both. You need a Torah and you need Nevi'im. It's not like you can live with one without the other. When it comes to kitvei kodesh, you need both, the Torah and the Nevi'im. And Amar Shmuel, you can, now again, what are we assuming right now? Not like the conclusion of the last sugya, but the way we thought originally, which is cholkin means one can force the other to divide it. So again, we're going to have the obvious answer, which is you can't bring Shmuel as a proof for anything because it's not the same case at all, because Hatirgam Rav Shalman b'sharatzu. Rav Shalman already told us that case is only if you decide both of you want to divide it. Then you can divide it and you can divvy up the money and figure out who owes who more. And then it's okay if one gets not something complete and the other gets not something complete because there was no force here. Everyone did it willingly on their own volition. That's totally fine. Good or agud, when I can force you to do something, it's only when you're going to either end up with the complete item or I will end up with the complete item and you will end up with the complete monetary value of what you need to buy the complete item. And that's not the case of these two maidservants. And that's why that wasn't a question at all on the psak to go like Rav Yehuda, because that's not a case of good or agud. That's the end of our sugya of good or agud. Now we're going to move on to something else that is here because of our sugya that we just discussed and got into kitvei kodesh, We're now going to talk about how they wrote Sifrei Kodesh. And from here, we're going to get to tomorrow's daf is a very famous daf, because the daf that's going to talk about the order of the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim and who wrote what book, and a very, very famous daf. That's Bava Batra Yudalit. So looking forward to tomorrow's daf. In the meantime, we're going to get started. Tanu Rabbanan. So we're going to quote a Beit. Madbik Adam Torah Nevi'im U'Ktuvim Ke'echad Devrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says you can write. Now here we're not talking about a printed book like a Tanakh. We're talking about a Megillah, or a parchment. So you can write a book that starts with Torah, goes through Nevi'im, and goes through Ketuvim. Rabbi Meir says no problem. Rav Yehuda Omer, Torah b'fnei atzma, Nevi'im b'fnei atzma, Ketuvim b'fnei atzma. We don't want people to confuse and think that the Torah is like the Nevi'im, the Nevi'im is like the Ketuvim. Each one is a separate book. Each one has to be written separately. You can't bind them together. Third opinion, each, perhaps even each chumash on its own, each sefer Navi on its own. You can't even put books together, okay, within the Nevi'im or within the Ketuvim. Everything's separate. So 3 different opinions about what you can put together or not. Va'amar Rav Yehuda, Maaseh b'Beit ben Zonin, Shayul Shmona Nevi'im medubakin ke'echad, al pi Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. We didn't see Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, but must have held that way. Beit ben Zonin, he had a book where he put all 8 Nevi'im together. Okay, 8 Nevi'im are the number of Nevi'im that there are. Right, there's Yoshua, Shoftim, Shmuel, Malachim, Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, Yechezkel, and Treasar. Treasar is 12 books, but they're considered as one here, although in a minute you'll see not necessarily. Although some people say that the story with Beit ben Zuna wasn't that he put 8 books together. It was Lo Ayalo Elecha Vecha B'Pnei Atzmo. He actually wrote each one separately, okay? And it was the opposite of what we said. I'm a Rebbe. Here's now Rebbe's going to support Rabbi Meir's opinion. They brought a book that was Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, Medubakim Ke'echad. They were all together. And we said it was okay. Okay, putting all these in one book. And the next issue they're discussing is Ben Chumash l'Chumash shel Torah or Ba'ashitin. When you finish a book of Torah, when you're in, you get to the end of Sefer Breshit, in a Sefer Torah, you have to leave 4 blank lines. And in Sifrei Nevi'im, u'ben kol navi u'navi, u'benavi shel shnei masal, and within the 12 of Treasar, shlosha shitin, you have to leave 3 lines. Okay, so that's the distinction between a Sefer Torah, a book of the Torah, and a book of the Nevi'im. You leave 4 lines after the Torah, 3 lines for Nevi'im, and another difference is, most people think this is only for Nevi'im, mesayem milamatu matzchil milamala. If you finish toward the bottom and there aren't 3 lines, you don't have to leave extra lines at the top of the next column. You start at the top of the next column because it's already a clean break, right? So the whole issue of leaving the extras, if you wanted to cut or something, you won't cut near the letters, right? If you wanted to divide them. So if it's already at the top of the next column, you don't need to worry about that. Tanu Rabbanan, we're just going to start the next bright. I would say lidabek Torah Nevi'im U'Ktuvim ke'echad midabek. If you want to put them together, you can. This goes like Rabbi Meir. Now, here we're talking about if you make a Sefer Torah, you know that a Sefer Torah has 2 rods, and then it's wrapped, right? There's the middle, and it's wrapped around each side. But if you're going to do a Torah Nevi'im U'Ktuvim, you're going to make it like a Megillah, and therefore, now here we're talking about laws of margins. This is really like for a typesetter, and this kind of sugya. You do it oseh b'rosho kadei lagul amud. You leave a small margin in the beginning just to wrap it around. That very beginning part has to wrap around a pole, right? Or I don't know exactly the word you would call it, but it wraps around, okay? And then bisofo kadei lagul hekef. At the end, you have to leave a very wide margin. Why? Because if you roll the Megillah, it's going to be much wider at the end, and you want the final roll to basically have a hole, right? A whole circumference around that's blank. So you have to leave a big margin, right? You can assess, you can try to estimate how wide it will have to be based on how long it is and how, and that you need it like that. Okay, and then again, if you end at the bottom of a column, you could start at the top of the next column. We'll continue this tomorrow. So what did we do today? We started with this one, the crisscross X, pie-shaped division when there's a river and a water channel. Then we got into this case of the traklim where it's not worthy of division. Count one side, force the other. That was on machloket good or agud, yes or no. Rav Yehuda said yes. Rav Nachman said no. We brought a question against Rav Nachman. Of Rav, as we answered it, we brought 2 difficulties against Rav Yehuda. Answered them. We brought 1 difficulty against Rav Nachman. Did not have an answer, even though we tried to find one. And then we saw, we had another issue with Rav Yehuda's opinion, where we tried to say that Shmuel held the same way, and then we said no, Shmuel was talking about a totally different case, not where one side is forcing the other, right? And toch kedei all those sugya, we learned certain things about when good or agud is in effect, only when the person can choose both options, buy or sell, right? Only when, sorry, what were the other criteria? I'm just blanking. Right, only when they get a complete item, right, and not a partial item. And basically, right, that's it, right? So either, again, you have to have two possibilities and not just one side, like with the poor and the rich, and with the eved who can't sell himself again to be a slave, or you also need the complete item and not, again, assuming you need the complete item. If you need the complete item to be of any use, then you would need to get the complete item and not split it in the middle. And then we got to other stuff about kitvei kodesh, since we were talking about it. And from there, we'll get on a whole sidetrack about writing sifrei Torah and things that are really interesting to think about that you probably don't often think about how they're written, how many breaks there are, can you write them all together? Is it lack of respect for the Torah, let's say, to stick it with Nevi'im? You'll think it's got the same sanctity. And there were different opinions about that. And we'll continue this tomorrow. Wishing everyone a good day and hoping for B'salat Tovot.